Hello everyone, today we read and comment the second chapter of the fifth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being Theater of War, Army and Campaign. The text follows. The nature of the things that does not allow of a completely satisfactory definition of these three factors denoting respectively space, mass, and time in war, but that we may not sometimes be quite misunderstood. We must try to make somewhat plainer the usual meaning of these terms, to which we shall in most cases adhere. 1. Theater of war. This term denotes properly such a portion of the space over which war prevails, as has its boundaries protected and thus possesses a kind of independence. This protection may consist in fortresses, or important natural obstacles presented by the country, or even in its being separated by a considerable distance from the rest of the space embraced in the war. Such a portion is not a mere piece of the wall, but a small wall complete in itself, and consequently it is more or less in such a condition that changes which take place at other points in the seat of war have only an indirect and no direct influence upon it. To give an adequate idea of this, we may suppose that on this portion an advance is made, whilst in another quarter a retreat is taking place, or that upon an army is acting defensively, whilst an offensive is being carried on upon the other. Such a clearly defined idea, as this is not capable of universal application, it is here used merely to indicate the line of distinction. 2. Army. With the assistance of the conception of a theater of war, it is very easy to say what an army is. It is, in point of fact, the mass of troops in the same theater of war. But this plainly does not include all that is meant by the term in its common usage. Blücher and Wellington commanded each a separate army in 1815, although the two were in the same theater of war. The chief command is therefore another distinguishing sign for the conception of an army. At the same time, this sign is very nearly allied to the preceding, for where things are well organized, there should only exist one supreme command in a theater of war, and the commander-in-chief in a particular theater of war should always have a proportionate degree of independence. The mere absolute numerical strength of a body of troops is less decisive on the subject than might at first appear, for where several armies are acting under one command and upon one and same theater of war, they are called armies not by reason of their strength, but from the relations antecedent to the war, 1813 the Silesian army, the Army of the North, etc., and although we should divide a great mass of troops intended to remain the same theater into a corps, we should never divide them into armies. At least such a division would be contrary to what seems to be the meaning which is universally attached to them. On the other hand, it would certainly be pedantry to apply the term army to each band of irregular troops acting independently in a remote province. Still, we must not leave unnoticed that it surprises no one when we find the army of the Vendeans in the Revolutionary War is spoken of, and yet it was not much stronger. The conceptions of army and theater of war, therefore, as a rule, go together and mutually include each other. 3. Campaign. Although the sum of all military events which happen in all theaters of war in 1 year often called a campaign, still, however, it is more usual and more exact to understand by the term the events in one single theater of war. But it is worse still to connect the notion of a campaign with the period of 1 year, for wars no longer divide themselves naturally into campaigns of a year's duration by fixed and long periods in winter quarters, as however the events in a theater of war themselves, from certain great chapters, if for instance the direct effects of some more or less great catastrophe cease, and new combinations begin to develop themselves, therefore these natural subdivisions must be taken into consideration in order to allot to each year campaign its complete share of events. No one would make the campaign of 1812 terminate at Memel, where the armies were on the 1st of January, and transferred the further retreat of the French until they recrossed the Elbe to the campaign of 1813, as that further retreat was plainly only a part of the world retreat from Moscow. That we cannot give these conceptions any greater degree of distinctness is of no consequence, because they cannot be used as a philosophical definition for the basis of any kind of proportions. They only serve to give a little more clearness and precision to the language we use. So, as we have seen, this is a terminological chapter in which von Clausewitz explains what are these three main factors in the theory of the art of war, the theater of war, the army, and the campaign, how they interplay with one another, and therefore how we can fundamentally use our military in war, right? On the base specifically of these factors. So let's simply read the definitions, because they're fairly simple and yet are important, even conceptually speaking, to just picture certain dimensions that, as von Clausewitz himself points out, are not to be meant in a let's say in a specific sense, like in a categorizing sense all the time. That is to say, it's very difficult to trace boundaries to determine exactly what it is. I don't know, a theater of war, an army proper, a campaign, right? Because everything is out there in reality. What's the boundary concretely, right? It can depend. It can mean literally different things depending on other factors that are interfering at all times. And given that we're still talking about the theory of the art of war, this is fundamentally only as far as the military dimension is concerned. So any other factor intervening in this, and that can be political, for example, social, like, can inject other military, right, in the system, and therefore disrupt literally what all of these three things fundamentally are. This is important also just from an historical point of view, because it brings a bit more of clarity also in what we define, generally speaking, not just in the Vom Kriege, but when we want to discuss, in fact, a specific theater, or define what an army specifically is, and when there is a campaign that begins or ends, or what we really mean by it. So von Clausewitz says, okay, theater of war, army, campaign. The nature of the things does not allow of a completely satisfactory definition of these three factors, denoting respectively space, mass, and time in war. Right? These are the three main indicators. That is to say, you would confuse, I presume, sometimes the theater of war with campaign. Right? I mean, perhaps not if you literally understand what it means in English, but meaning that sometimes the term theater of war is, presented as not much the spatial dimension in itself, but a bit all what is going on in that specific context, which is also a thing, because the theater of war is naturally affected by the army, by the campaign, by whatever is happening there, but it's still meant here properly in a spatial dimension that does include, as we will see, specific even infrastructures, features of terrain. It can be from very from geography to fortresses, lots of aspects that we have also partly looked at previously in the Vom Kriege. Then the army, that specifically embodies the mass, right? The mass of the armed forces, literally what you have of the mass of forces, right? Properly in its human dimension, in terms of moral and physical strength, as we've seen, and so what you have literally to chop down, right, in order to get the thing done. And three, the campaign, that pertains to time, right? Campaign at this point is not the theater, as we've seen. It's specifically how does all this go on over time. You understand that this is not a satisfaction definition. Von Clausewitz admits it, and it's good for the practical use that we have to make of it. Anyway, so von Clausewitz says, but in fact that we may not sometimes be quite misunderstood. We must try to make somewhat plainer the usual meaning of these terms, to which we shall, in most cases, adhere. So, 1. Theater of war So this term denotes properly such a portion of the space over which war prevails as has its boundaries protected, and thus possesses a kind of independence. It's interesting how he puts that, because it's as if, um, we extraneated this spatial dimension from the rest of the world. Right? It says here, has its boundaries protected. What does it really mean? It means fundamentally that you're not necessarily expecting at the moment an interference from another area. Right? So that when you talk about theater of war, it can be literally, I don't know, the whole Eastern Front during World War II, or it can be like 10 meters square. It all in a brawl. It really can depend on a lot of factors, and this is not the point, but rather how much you're fundamentally focusing on, in terms also of the mass of time, right, and what you expect in that fight taking place is, spatially concerned. And in fact, it does possess a kind of independence. That's how we should see it. And you understand how unsatisfactory it is as a definition, because war is by definition, von Clausewitz criticizes the same concept of the geographical dimension as the most, as a fundamentally important element, right? He says this is not the point. Things are very fluid, very extent, multidimensional, if you want. And it's never been truer than today, in a way, right? Our geographical boundaries are ever more surpassed, but the concept here is rather that, of course, the space can arrive to be, invested by lots of other mass, right, in interest of time. Just to use the Clausewitzian here lexicon is being used, and therefore everything can change at every given moment. This is not a chess game, right? And the war always presents, by definition, the unforeseen, right? What you have not expected, which is especially what the enemy will seek in order to surprise you fundamentally and put you into a condition of increased disadvantage. Von Clausewitz explains better what this protection of this space, what this boundary is properly made of. It says the protection may consist in fortresses, or important natural obstacles presented by the country, or even in its being separated by a considerable distance from the rest of the space embraced in the war. And this really gives the beautiful definition of it, because at this point it's not even spatially divided, because space continues always, apparently. And it's that, yet, I don't know, an army so far that you don't care about it. So, once again, it's the focus you have on a specific military reality. Also, von Clausewitz says, such a portion is not a mere place of the wall, but a small wall complete in itself. And this is also very, in fact, very subjective, as you understand. It really depends on that focus, what you are contemplating here. So this is not to be considered specifically as a theater of war as something that you can. This is just for as far as the deployment of the armed forces is concerned. So it's not that in real war we don't think all the time of whatever is happening in the whole world, right? Because that always influences. Here we're just tracing the lineaments of the theory art of war, for which, if you have to solve a tactical or a strategical problem, you have to necessarily set these boundaries. You have, in other words, necessarily approximate, just as geographical maps are by definition always approximated, that there is nothing and there will never be anything that can represent the world as it is, right? It's only an approximation, and this approximation is naturally balanced, it's regulated on the basis of the practical use that you're going to make of itself, right? So this view does extraneate your conception of the wall, because the wall is restricted to these boundaries that you have decided. And von Clausewitz says, and consequently it is more or less in such a condition that changes which take place at other points in the seat of war have only an indirect and no direct influence upon it. That is specifically that you may even realize, of course, that all what is happening outside does have an impact in a way, because how is that you, for example, can't consider a thing like the weather. I mean, and something that changes. It comes from a dimension that you don't even take into consideration, militarily speaking, because where do you care that those clouds, that perturbance to arrive from, right? Important is what happens there, right? So that how this will eventually come to impact that reality is can be direct, but there are also factors that are indirectly even helping to set that boundary. That is to say, I don't know, the same reason why I consider this military action taking place on it, it's because there is something beyond, right, that reality, that boundary. But specifically, I don't care about it, right? It's not happening directly. It's just already within the wall, and that's for now what I have to just take into consideration. Being aware that, yeah, some change is going to occur, the same boundary is going to vary, that at some point I will forget about this specific insignificant place because we'll move to another, right? War comes to be fought in places that you wouldn't even know they existed, and that's also why it's a very good way of learning geography along the way. But it is definitely to consider at the moment as what matters for the solving of the strictly military problem. Also, for Clausewitz says, to give an adequate idea of this, we may suppose that on this portion an advance is made, whilst in another quarter a retreat is taking place, or that upon the one an army is acting defensively, whilst an offensive is being carried out upon the other. Right? What does this mean? He's telling you essentially that in order to define such a space, imagine that it's literally, I mean, at the simplest level, just the space you're advancing in. So literally the place you're in right now, and you're moving your forces right now, right? And at the same time, this is also the place you can't come back through, can't retreat through. And equally, this can be a place where, from one side you're attacking, but you can also, and the other side is defending, right? So, literally the place in which properly also the, not just the reciprocity, but the room of maneuver. I mean, there is both the spatial dimension is still also the military one attached. So, it has both to do with the room of maneuver that you need for just even moving, not specifically fighting, but also for fighting and carrying out that fight, so that both sides are included in the account. Because here the boundary is traced not as much as what you can see, but whatever you know that can serve to that specific military purpose. So obviously the enemy is included in all this, right? And it's very simple as a concept. Really, there is nothing else to point. Clausewitz says such a clearly defined idea as this is not capable of universal application, which means that, of course, you can't ever be sure of it. There is properly not actually any single reality that you can simply separate from the rest of the world, right? There is always going to be an interference in a way. But Clausewitz also adds, it is here used merely to indicate the line of distinction. Then to the army. Clausewitz says, with the assistance of the conception of a theater of war, so naturally all these three things interplay, which is evident, as we said at the beginning, it is very easy to say what an army is. It is, in point of fact, the mass of troops in the same theater of war. You can read it simply saying, okay, there is a space, there are soldiers on it, and simply, trace the boundaries of it and count how many troops there are in there. That's it. Clausewitz adds, but this plainly does not include all that is meant by the term in its common usage. We're talking about the term army specifically. For example, he says, Blücher and Wellington commanded each a separate army in 1815, although the two were in the same theater of war. Right? So here it's not much, as we will see, much of a conceptual problem what an army is, because that's fundamentally clear, but rather also the ways we call such, even organically speaking, such units, right? The army can be technically even just a squad, right? Think about the difference also between, I don't know, an army corps and a division, and think, what is an arm, right? It can be literally even one soldier if you want, if that's all what is included in there, at least another one to fight against. And that's probably what you count as it, right? So it's obvious that given the reality of how wars are fought, what the amount of troops you're going to find in this theater of war is counting for an army. Doesn't matter if it's small or large, but it's fundamentally most of the time a real thing. It's not important. Von Clausewitz makes the example of the Waterloo campaign because, of course, there were allies fundamentally with separate commands. So we see here the problem, the unity of command is fundamentally very important. So that you can count, in the case of the Prussians, of Blücher, and the British of Wellington, specifically two different armies in the same theater of war that are, however, fighting together against a common enemy. So von Clausewitz adds, the chief command is therefore another distinguishing sign for the conception of an army. At the same time, this sign is very nearly allied to the preceding, for where things are well organized, there should only exist one supreme command in a theater of war. And the commander-in-chief in a particular theater of war should always have a proportionate degree of independence. These are some principles of war, the one of the unity of command, also. And by the way, considering here that historically speaking, this is not to be given for granted, not even today, in a way. The wars of coalition are always, in a way, marked by, even if there is an actual hierarchy and good organization, but even in the same army, right? Not even just in a coalition. Every piece of this army is fundamentally autonomous by a certain degree. So you will never have a perfect control, but usually what is hoped, at least, and this is what the point von Clausewitz is making, is that in a campaign there is a unity of command, so that, at least for the sake of the theory, the art of war, we know what the hell we're doing, what area we're controlling. We are in full control, namely, of our own troops, right? And this derives from a better organization. That is to say that even in a coalition, of course, a good organization has always, not properly a shared command, but, at least not necessarily, but, a united command that decides what the hell must be done, so that everything is done in a way or in another. And even if this, you would think, may increase the problem of making a mistake, still this, for the sake of carrying out the military action, is more preferable than a split command. We will discuss these things maybe on other videos to explain a bit the classical principles of war and so on. But here the problem is more trivial in a way, because it's really a linguistical problem that von Clausewitz's point is caring about, to say, okay, let's not this freaks imagine I'm talking about something else. So von Clausewitz also, and the matter of the independence, of course, that an army in itself, as far as the military action is concerned, specifically, should be independent. Right, should be, at least every commander, every officer in the hierarchy should be partially capable of doing whatever, a bit of what he wants, right? And naturally, the commander-in-chief is the one that has full authority in this regard, which is never real, but at least it's recognized as such in the army structure to work like that. That this has nothing to do with the political mandate that is always interfering in the thing at all times, as far as the military is concerned. Then von Clausewitz writes, the mere absolute numerical strength of a body of troops is less decisive on the subject than might at first appear. For where several armies are acting under one command and upon one at the same theatre of war, they are called armies not by reason of their strength, but from the relations antecedent to the war, 1813, the Silesian Army, the Army of the North, etc. And although we should divide a great mass of troops intended to remain in the same theatre into corps, we should never divide them into armies. At least such a division would be contrary to what seems to be the meaning which is universally attached to them. Right? Also here it's a linguistical problem. Of course there are different armies in a very large theatre. Think about the one of 1813, or even stretched throughout all Central Europe. But the point is, and if so, of course, that there are certain corps that are split, and therefore take the name of armies, right? But it's just a convention in a way, because at the end, everything was, centralized in command for, at least for 19th century standards, right? And it was all part of a broader plan in which there is, in fact, a single commander, at least from, what the French side was concerned, that controlled, namely, everything. Then von Clausewitz says, of course, on the other hand, it would certainly be pedantry to apply the term army to each band of irregular troops acting independently in a remote province. Right? Still, we must not leave unnoticed that it surprises no one when the army of the Vendeans in the Revolutionary War is spoken of, and yet it was not much stronger. Why? Because, of course, as far as the theater of war was concerned, we can say, okay, look at what are we looking at? We're talking about the Vendean theater of war. And therefore, the army that acted there, doesn't matter, it was, not great much, but still, it was enough for us to concentrate on that scenario and say, okay, this is an army, and that's what we're looking at, because objectively, it's the thing that is getting the job done from their side. So that's the point. So as you understand, it's merely conventional, right? There isn't much more added to this. And in fact, von Clausewitz adds, the conceptions of army and theater of war therefore as a rule go together and mutually include each other, because of course you couldn't specifically say what is an army, what is a theater of war, if you do not define respectively what the theater of war and the army respectively is, right? So that's the convention of it, and that's the arbitrary, if you want. Arbitrary, of course, always through some logic, some criterion that you attribute properly to this perspective. You can call it a perspective. Then 3, campaign. Von Clausewitz writes, although the sum of all military events which happen in all the theaters of war in 1 year is often called a campaign, still it is more usual and more exact to understand by the term the events in one single theater of war. But it is worse still to connect the notion of a campaign with the period of 1 year, for wars no longer divide themselves naturally into campaigns of a year's duration by fixed and long periods in winter quarters. Right? So even in here, it's a matter of saying, what is a campaign? Right? It's objectively more difficult to define than defining what a theater of war, what an army is. They, in a way, are kind of intuitive. A campaign is measured, as we've seen, by time, and it has to do evidently with the continuation of, the operational activity at some point, so that it's obvious that if you have an army that even, is quartered for winter, it's still the same army. There is still a continuity, right? But we say, at least for those historical periods for which operations stopped in the bad season, okay, well then, before it was a campaign, then it stopped, then later came the other one. But in von Clausewitz's times, already this thing had been far bypassed, right? So, and he makes an example afterwards that will clarify the thing. Before he adds, as however, the events in a theater of war themselves from certain great chapters, if for instance the direct effects of some more or less great catastrophe cease, and new combinations begin to develop themselves, therefore these natural subdivisions must be taken into consideration in order to allot to each year campaign, in brackets, its complete share of events. No one would, and here's the example that clarifies, it says, no one would make the campaign of 1812 terminate at Memel, where the armies were on January the 1st, and transfer the further retreat of the French until they recrossed the Elbe to the campaign of 1813, as that further retreat was plainly only a part of the whole retreat from Moscow. Right? Operationally speaking, this whole thing had very few to do with, okay, let's arbitrarily say on January the 1st, 1813, we're starting to talk about the 1813 campaign. That doesn't make much sense. It was all part of this great wall. We have already met this concept, right? You know, it's like a stream, all the different currents that intertwine with each other, and you can't see the river and where it goes, but you can't say where, the single currents begin or stop, but you still see what the thing. So, this is a bit the same in a way, metaphorically, as to look at to a campaign, because the 1813 campaign was nothing basically but the prosecution, at least of the retreat of the 1812 invasion of Russia, right? So that eventually will end in the next year, but through all a time that is part all the same thing. And interestingly, there are campaigns, even when there is objectively a long suspension of the military activity, even for, seasonal reasons, as we've seen now, but that, however, are still, out there, right? Still the troops are, for example, potentially engageable, and therefore the military activity there is fundamentally connected to this potential. You can read, of course, every tactical and strategical action as fundamentally part of the continuation of a campaign. So even this definition is not satisfactory, but it serves the clarification of what we are conceptualizing as such, right? So then eventually every reality is different. Even here, you can't, as we've seen, draw a clear line of distinction. Can't be categorical, but it's helpful to use it, and that's why von Clausewitz concludes by stating that we cannot give these conceptions any greater degree of distinctness is of no consequence, because they cannot be used as philosophical definitions for the basis of any kind of propositions. They only serve to give a little more clearness and precision to the language we use. That's it. And sometimes, I can't tell you, it's pretty much it, right? Even when you write a historical work, there are lots of things you could speculate on, but at a certain point, are there some that actually matter? It's often also when you try, especially to explain. Here, von Clausewitz is making the same point, right? Von Clausewitz is stating, okay, we'll be talking about this stuff. I'll clarify to you what this vocabulary is about, but not just by saying, okay, I will mean red by blue, right? But explaining specifically what the essential reality of these of these factors, as he has defined them, are. Right? Doesn't matter that it's difficult to trace borders around them, to define them better. The important thing is that we fundamentally agree on the fundamentals that are pretty clear in this regard, as always, in the Vom Kriege. So this was the second chapter, the fifth book that we have began last time, and for now we stop it here. Next time we'll talk about the relation of power. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.